want to get us started and respect everyone's time on this beautiful day. I'm really glad that you're joining us because we don't usually present during the day, but we really wanted to be here for folks who are working with young people. So if you're an educator, if you're a prevention provider, really, really glad that you're here with us. So 21st Century Teens, brought to you by Montgomery County Office of Drug and Alcohol. Thank you so much. I know Katie Cush is on the meeting. Really grateful for this relationship that we have with Montco and for bringing this program to you. We are recording this program, but we're very glad that you're here live in real time because we would love to have time at the end of Heather's presentation for you to ask some questions and have some conversation with us. But we will, if any kind of personal question comes up, please rest assured that we will edit that out of the finished product before we post it on YouTube. So anything personal that's asked, we'll make sure to remove that. We might reference it, but we will not see your image, your name, anything like that. But we encourage that kind of communication. So please don't hesitate to ask a question. At the end of this program, a survey will pop up. Please take a moment to complete that survey. Even if you've completed our surveys before, it helps us very much to get your feedback, to learn about topics that you would like to hear in the future, and so on. The follow-up for this program is on our website, conversation.zone/addiction. I know that feels like a heavy word for when we're talking about kids with that are in K through 12, but addiction to some of the things that Heather Gregan is going to be talking about is a real thing, and we want to make sure that you have access to all the resources surrounding process addictions, behavioral addictions that Heather's going to be talking about. I'm so excited to introduce you to Heather Gregan. Heather is a dear friend. She is one of the founders of Be a Part of the Conversation. And so we go back, and I'm very indebted to Heather for all the guidance she's provided me personally and all of our families over the years. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Heather get her slide deck going and introduce herself. So go ahead, Heather, and get yourself set up with your deck.
Okay. Okay, I think we're set. Am I set here?
Perfect. Looks beautiful.
All right. Sounds good. A quick introduction. My name is Heather Gregan, as Kim said, and I've been with Be a Part of Conversation since 2013, although as time went on, I became more like a full-time single mom. And so the working single mom thing kind of took over, and that became the focus of managing my life. With that said, I have an almost 14-year-old, so the relevance of this topic really fits personally for me, as well as the process of observing the development of my son and being a treatment provider in the field. And I've been a treatment provider in the field about 20 years, and started out with adolescent addictions, substance abuse primarily with adjudicated youth, mostly from Camden, then ended up at Rehab After School for quite a number of years, a little bit of a different demographic, and then did a little bit of work at Living Grin, doing the adolescent program there, returning back to light program, life counseling, to do some co-occurring work, substance use and mental health issues with high-risk teens at that time, and women's trauma work. Now I have a balance of doing private practice and also working for Ethos Treatment with a mental health intensive outpatient adult IOP. So that's a little bit about me. Kim asked me to do this presentation. She thought that this was something that the community needed. And I have to be totally honest with you. I'm a therapist. I'm not a presenter. So with that said, I bring my experience. I bring my authenticity and the observations that I've had over the years, not just with clients, but also in my personal life. So, hopefully I can bring that component to you guys so that, it feels connected, because to me, that's the most important thing, is this level of social connection. And that's, a big piece of what we are missing right now. So with that said, just like I would start any other group, I'm going to invite myself and I'm going to invite anybody else to kind of get a little bit more comfortable into their bodies, because if our frontal lobe isn't online, we're not going to get very much out of being here. So some people know these buzzwords like vagus nerve activation, deep breathing, moving the body. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a couple of vagus nerve activation exercises. And what we're doing is I'm just kind of getting myself into the body a little bit more deeply relaxed, allowing my, hopefully, brain and body to connect in such a way that, I can deliver this message from a heartfelt place while I'm looking just at a screen. And that's a little tricky to do. So here we go. I'm going to see if I can get our screen to work, because right now, Kim, I'm seeing that I'm pushing down on the arrow and it's not going down. So
sometimes you have to try it a second time. Try it again.
I'm trying again. It's not working. Yes. Try again. Oh,
there you go. Now it's fine.
Oh, hey, look at that. All right. Some very basic statistics. I already really like the smiles and laughter, so I'm appreciating that. Some basic statistics. Some of this is important. Some of this, some people might find is not that important, because we do know that there's a problem. We do know that there's an issue. It's more about highlighting where that problem is and how we can start to really intervene to make some changes. So, basic statistics, National Survey on Drug Use and Health, 2022, 19.5% of our youth are suffering from at least one major depressive episode, and 11.5% met criteria for severe depression. 60% of those did not receive mental health services. 1 in 8 ages 12 to 17 had serious thoughts of suicide. 1 in 15 made a plan. And 1.6 million youth between the ages of 12 and 17 attempted suicide. 17.3% reported having a substance use disorder. We all know what Monitoring the Future survey is all about, and this one just highlighting some of the pieces around substance use in particular. And not surprisingly, nicotine, marijuana use, and alcohol being the highest levels of use. And there wasn't a great shift between before the pandemic and after the pandemic and during the pandemic, a little bit of a decline. But for the most part, it stayed the same, with the exception, of course, of fentanyl, because when fentanyl kind of entered the market, the overdose deaths increased. And as you can see, it increased almost 100%, an increase of 94%. And so we're seeing that that piece was really important to take into consideration. But in addition to that, education is making a difference, because the perception of the dangers of substance use from 8th grade to 12th grade are increasing. So 12th graders are aware of the dangers of narcotics more than 8th graders, which tells us that we still need to educate, and education is effective. In addition to symptoms of depression, there's also a real increase in anxiety and an over-reliance, of course, on social media use and gaming, and more importantly, a decrease in ability to manage emotions. And that, to me, as a clinician, is probably one of the highlights that I want to focus on today, is how challenging it is for our young people to manage their emotions and why it is. And also just looking at social loneliness and the social loneliness scale, 53% are saying that they are too shy and introverted to connect with others. 27% say they don't really feel like they need friends. 20% say friendships are too much work. And 19% say that the place that they have lived kind of have the wrong people in it. I've got to say that in my personal experience in listening to young people talk, I've heard that many, many times, almost like, I'm a star blob that landed in the wrong planet. And so there's this kind of perception of being different from other people and having other people not really understand them. And of course, they're not seeing their overuse of technology as any reason for why they're not able to socially connect. In fact, instead, they're seeing it as the solution for the discomfort that they're feeling as a response to not being able to connect or feel socially connected to friends. One thing that we do have some statistics on, and we're looking at process addictions kind of as a theme, is gaming. And a lot of people make the assumption, well, gaming is addictive. And I just want to kind of identify that it's really a little bit more finesse than that. And so the statistics are saying 1.4% of the population of youth are meeting criteria for addiction, 7.3% are identified as problem gamers, and 3.9% engaged gamers. 97% of American youth are playing video games. 90% of parents are concerned, but 87.3% are at a normal level of gaming. So it's kind of important to look at that it's not necessarily about the vice as much as it's about all of the things that we're going to talk about moving forward. And it's about the management of the device. But we do see that depression, suicidal ideation, and anxiety have been associated with excessive use of gaming. And importantly, and I think, again, like when we look at what are we going to do about this situation, less than an hour a day is not associated with mental health problems. More than 3 hours a day is associated with lower life satisfaction. I have something to quickly say about that, but I'll bring it maybe to the level of intervention and like having conversations and empowering youth to make some observations themselves about their relationship with these devices. But there is a really cool article. It's actually a chapter of an upcoming book. And this author, John Haidt, really talks about how this issue with mental health surged between 2010 and 2019 and highlighted the smartphone kind of as a big part of the reasons that this happened. And we're going to, again, take apart some of these issues connected with this, but we can see rates of anxiety and depression in the US rose more than 50% between 2010 and 2019. Suicide rates for adolescents ages 10 to 19 rose 48%, and oh my gosh, girls, it rose 131%. So it's pretty significant. I mean, it's hugely significant. Academics declined, loneliness and friendlessness surged, exercise and sleep declined. He really highlights this idea of the decline of play and independence and how that decline affected the ability to meet certain developmental tasks, and how our youth became shyer, more anxious, and more risk averse as they weren't able to kind of experiment on a social level with the typical things that we would to meet it with adversity and overcome adversity and find the success with overcoming adversity. And because we didn't get those social experiences, or these young ones didn't get those social experiences, there's an increase in avoidance behavior overall and more of a perception of an inability to cope with challenges and increase in social anxiety. And of course, with the access to the phone and being able to compare themselves to others, that's increasing their lower self-esteem. And, Mike talked about the fear of missing out. And as they're looking and being, exposed to the things that other people are doing and friends are doing, that fear of missing out is increasing their anxiety quite a lot, decreasing their self-esteem. One that we didn't mention in here, but also peer bullying. 50% of American youth report that they feel addicted to their devices. I think that that's something I bring up later as well. So what's going on here? I actually wrote Dr. Thomas, but it's Dr. Thompson, so I'm going to make a correction there. Dr. Thompson was an incredible speaker first year, be part of the conversation. Kim actually clarified it was the first presentation. And with that presentation, he talked about the malfunction of the pleasure center of the brain. And as an addictions therapist, that was a game changer for me, because I was sitting in group and I was looking at all these kiddos and they were having clean drug screens. But even as they were having clean drug screens, they were like popping Oreo cookies, and they had 3 like energy drinks with them, and they were bringing in Pringles, and they, were sitting in group, and Pokemon Go was, on their phone, and they jump out of group to go, check out where they might be able to find a Pokemon Go in the middle of the group. And I was like, what is going on here? Because we were hopping around like squirrels, right? And so what Dr. Thompson had talked about was the malfunction of the pleasure center of the brain, which means that once you get the gas on the pleasure center, it's really hard to put that gas off, turn that gas off. And for some of our youth, it's even more challenging for various reasons, a lot of it having to do with, developmental delays and neurodevelopmental disorders, as well as other co-occurring mental health disorders. But one of the messages that Dr. Thompson really talked about was this notion of what goes up must come down. And this is repeated later on with Dr. Anna Lemke's work in Dopamine Nation that I'm going to, reference in a minute and talk about in a minute. But when we think about this idea of what goes up must come down, when somebody engages in a behavior that brings about pleasure, there's a peak and there's an experience of a positive, and then it goes down below baseline. And so somebody starts to feel like a negative feeling or like a not so great feeling before they hit baseline. And so as time goes on and someone engages in pleasure-seeking behaviors, what happens is those peaks get higher and the dips get lower. And over a period of time, over lots of time, that just becomes more and more of an increase, which becomes the progression of addiction. And so whenever I see any little kid, young, 17, 23, because I'm going to say it like that because they're in the pleasure center of their brain, I'm thinking, okay, you just told me something really great, like you sold your bike. And I'm super excited for you that you sold your bike, but I'm waiting for the come down because I'm aware that there's going to be a come down. And I'm also trying to note then, how are we going to start to cope with that come down? And a lot of times what tends to happen is they don't cope with that come down. They look for the next pleasure. And that's something that we're going to talk about in terms of process addiction. So like I said, with the malfunction of the pleasure center of the brain, there's co-occurring complications with other diagnoses. Some of the diagnoses connected with imbalances of the pleasure center of the brain are the ones I have listed here: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, OCD, bipolar, psychosis, autism, anxiety, PTSD, and complex PTSD. So I'm going to take a moment, just do a little raspberry, because I'm trying to move through pretty quickly, but I also don't want to get lost in the sauce here. So I'm going to take a drink of water and move on to Anna Lemke's work. I'm going to explain a little bit more about Anna Lemke's work, but at the same time, while I'm doing it, I want those of us out here that are really engaged in this process to think about what your sugar water is. What your drug of choice is. So Anna Lemke is a psychiatrist somewhere out in the West. I can't remember exactly the state right now. She does a lot of really great work around looking at the effects of dopamine and dopamine addiction. And so I could go on and on with the ideas that she's been able to express, but I'm going to tell you there's probably dozens of YouTube videos that you can watch that really explain this quite well. But Anna Lemke talks about what happens with this pleasure center of the brain. And I'm going to move to, I think, the next slide really quickly to see. Yeah. The role of dopamine in the reward pain pathway. So what Anna Lemke highlights is that there's a reward pain pathway, which means that the same pathway that dopamine is produced also is the same pathway that pain is produced. And What happens for us as we're just like moving through our development, our evolution, is that we're getting a steady hit of dopamine. It's just like a healthy way of staying in an adaptive response to the world. Why do we need dopamine? Because it motivates us for action. It motivates us to get food. It creates a reward for us when we get food. It gives us a sense of pleasure that will help us go out and kind of do the work to produce and affect some kind of task success. And so in evolution, we need this dopamine. And the way that the dopamine works, and she talks about this two sides of the balance, is that we need the dopamine in order to motivate us for action, like I said, to get the food and or to remove us from danger. And when we get the food, we get the reward. What happens then is that there's this shift in the pleasure-pain balance because we need that discomfort again to motivate us to get out there to get food again. And so in evolution, we need this process to work for us. What is also relevant is that, well, if we are in a world of scarcity, sometimes we won't be able to get access to that food. So what happens over time is we can get that balance again, where now we can kind of get back to that homeostasis, where we're functioning at this kind of balance level. But what has happened over time is that we're hitting the dopamine more than what we need in order to motivate ourselves to get the things that we need to get in this world, because food is aplenty now. And so, as I say here, there are no tigers out there to fight, and there's no food that we need to fight for. So we're not needing that as much dopamine, but we're hitting the dopamine button more than we need to survive. And that's leading to a dopamine saturation in a world of abundance. So I'm going to see if I can give you a little bit of an understanding of this. So with this balance, and she talks about when we hit that dopamine, what happens is that our dopamine receptors, they downregulate, which means there's less dopamine being produced at that moment. That's the pain. And so it stays down there on that balance until we need to hit it again, meaning that we need to go get food. But what happens over time is we're hitting dopamine more, and it's increasing that pain perception, that experience of pain. So over time, we end up with more of an imbalance where we're feeling more discomfort, more experience of pain, more cravings. And so we continue to hit that dopamine, hoping to fix it. But because there's always going to be that experience of pain in order to motivate, it has become imbalanced. So with, for example, we look at the levels for different vices in our world. We can see, I gave you examples, 50% higher would be chocolate. Sex and gaming is 100% above baseline. Nicotine is 150%. And cocaine and amphetamines 1,000%. And yet what Anna Lembke describes is that it doesn't really matter the substance because we have too much access to it anyway. So we can load up if we want on as much chocolate or pornography or gaming, and we can get to that saturation level even with some of these potentially less or like more benign or appearingly benign addictions. Which leads us to this reality of a process addiction. And so with the process addiction, because we are still trying to offset that experience of pain, we engage in a compulsive behavior that becomes detrimental to one's well-being, just like a substance use disorder. And it can result in serious consequences to oneself and others, withdrawal symptoms, changes in personality, narrowing life interests, and onset of other mental health disorders. So just like other addictions, we find ourselves in a world where we are in a compulsive pattern of chasing pleasure, and we're struggling to control that use. We're preoccupied by chasing the pleasure. And as the pain piles up on the paid side of the balance, the cravings start to increase again, and we continue to use the behavior despite the consequences of pain to self or other. So I wanted to do a word cloud here to get a feel from anybody if they had some ideas of what process addictions they might be dealing with, or the ones that are really sticking out for themselves in terms of their own kiddos, their students, anybody in particular for themselves. I have so many examples of my clients that are struggling with process addictions and the kinds of consequences that they're going through. And it's heart-wrenching, not being able to walk, for example, because you ran your legs off. Not being able to finish college because you cannot stop playing those video games. Extreme debt and stealing parents' credit cards and ending up in legal situations because you cannot stop ordering from Amazon. So these are real life issues that we're dealing with and we're seeing the consequences of. So does anybody have an idea or a thought on any other process addictions? We put that in the chat. That's okay. We can keep going because I have it listed still. Okay. So as I said, because we have access to so many ways to hit that pleasure button, the availability is there, the novelty through the phone, the video games, the lights, the drawing in, the social media, the YouTube, everything is kind of pulling in, and there's copious amounts of quantity and the potency is high. And so what happens is over time with all of those things, like I said before, it wouldn't matter what the drug of choice is. We're moving into an addiction process. And something really critical is that it's all on the phone. So even if your process addiction is not necessarily a phone addiction, all of the access to being able to make that process addiction work for you is on your phone. So if you look at all these examples of process addictions, gaming, gambling, social media use, shopping, romance and limerence, which is like, fantasizing, whether that, love addiction is with people in real life or whether it's just a story, Discord servers and engaging with people that we don't know, that kind of like the excitement and the thrill of having that conversation with an unknown person, or that need for social connection, and how because we are moving into that feel good, we don't stop ourselves from taking risks. And a lot of times it's a piece of this addiction process is moving into riskier and riskier experiences, which leads us to thinking about some of the other things, eating disorders and pornography and sex addiction. And our kiddos they're really exposed to this. And if we're not able to let them know what's going on, they're not seeing it, because what happens is that the feel good and the discomfort becomes that loop that they engage in to take care of that discomfort, that they're not in their frontal lobe. They're not deciding what's happening. It's just happening. And that's an important recognition of how addictions really do kind of take over. And so I don't know if anybody has seen it. I have seen it, and so I wrote it because I think it's such a big thing. As kiddos don't want to get out of bed. They don't need to get out of bed. They don't want to come to school. They want to stay connected to their devices all the time. A lot of times they sleep with their devices. Their devices are on some level while they're sleeping. So all of this, they're hardwired for looking for that pleasure. And they, as I said, they don't know what's going on. They don't know that this is happening to them. Just gave an example of a DSM diagnosis that's up for consideration. I may or may not, because I'm considering the time, if that's important. But I just wanted to show you that even though we're aware of this, almost like on a colloquial level at this point, it's taking a while for us to get to a place of making a medical diagnosis. Gambling is one of the ones that's in the DSM, and eating disorders is another one. Gaming, internet gaming is not, but I also want to just kind of note that a lot of people are seeing these kinds of symptoms with their young people. And I'll just say it's about 5. It's 5 or more that would indicate a recognition of a diagnosis. But in our classrooms, we are seeing the symptoms. And again, if we were engaging and I could see everybody's faces and we could have conversation, I would really be curious, what is it you're seeing? So all I can say is what I'm seeing. And so I'll see somebody coming into group, for example, and they've just played a video game and they are hyped up and they've got like language going off the wazoo. They got words and they got clicks and they got all kinds of things. And their stress level is at ease, and at the same time on high alert. It's kind of a wacky experience. And then I don't know, halfway between that and then the second part of group, they just kind of slump. First they talk about McDonald's or, where they might eat later on. And then they just kind of slump, and they get tired and they start to flatten out. And actually today I had one and they were like this, literally like this in group, right? And these are some of the things that we're seeing, not just in my group, but we're also seeing it in classrooms. And so we also see it at home. Personally, I've got a little one who has always demonstrated high risk for addiction. Since he was 2 or 3, I saw the signs of it. He's diagnosed ADHD, kind of on that spectrum, difficulty with reading social cues, a little socially awkward. He's my baby, so I can say that. But from the very beginning, he showed this malfunction of the pleasure center of the brain. And we manage his video game addiction very intentionally. And there are times where he'll come home after he's been, somewhere for a couple days, because I'm in a single family home, and he's like that. And I don't know what's wrong with me, Mom. And I'm dry. Oh, I'm so dry. I can't think and I'm tired. And I can see it. And I'm well, how long have you been on the video games this week? Oh, no, not that long. Right. And am I going to engage with him at that point about that? No way. I can just see the symptom. And we're going to talk a little bit about the intervention after the fact. But I just wanted to kind of highlight some of these symptoms that we'll see with high levels of dopamine and low levels of dopamine. Because like I said, when my kiddos are coming in with 3 energy drinks, I'm not seeing that kind of behavior right away. I'm seeing more of this other, the high levels, increased stress and anxiety and energy. So bottom line, we need to help them with balance. Process addictions often involve something that's necessary to survive. So usually it's not about a full abstinence. It's more about working the balance. We know our phones and devices aren't going anywhere. And so we have to help these kiddos be stewards of their own world. This is really something I've referenced before. The triune brain is a nice place for parents and teachers to think about okay, what brain are they in right now? So I'm trying to teach them something and I can see that they're staring at the ceiling or they're doodling or they're looking out the window. They're not likely to be in the frontal lobe. They're not likely to be in the neocortex. They're not likely to be in the thinking space of the brain. And they're more likely to be in that reptilian or the limbic part of the brain. And it's really relevant for how we're going to be intervening. It's also relevant for assessing whether they're getting what we're teaching them. And it's also helping us to assess what we need to shift in the classroom or for intervention so that we can, get them back online is what I would call it. So you can see these different pieces of the brain and how to conceptualize that. I also really like to geek out on the brain completely, especially around the insula and the cingulate cortex, because the cingulate cortex we know is kind of the regulator of the emotions. And the insula, powerful in therapy, in treatment. It's one of my most exciting words. And Jennifer Sweeten, who is a psychologist that did an EMDR training that was fabulous, I took this from her slide here because it has all of these different pieces that are highlighted. The insula is the part of the brain that feels into the body. And it's the part of the brain that when we're in active addiction, we're not really engaging. And so if we're in process addiction, we're not really in the feeling part of the body. And that's really critical because then we're also not regulating what we're feeling. And so what happens is we're like, boom, boom, boom. So we have the balance metaphor for the pleasure center of the brain and the pain. We also have this metaphor balance for feeling into the body and not feeling at all. And so we see this as like either hyperarousal, which is like we are feeling way too much, or we're feeling nothing at all. And this looks like depression, apathy, anhedonia, inability to feel, high-risk behaviors, addiction. So when we turn that insula this way, that's what happens, which means when it's not active, that tends to be what happens. And why is that important for intervention? We want our kiddos to be able to sense feeling in the body and cope with it. And so the insula is critical for doing the work that we're doing. And when we were doing the vagus nerve activation early on, that was an intention to be able to touch in to our ability to feel. Because if we're able to be online and we're able to feel, we're going to be able to integrate this information more effectively. So that's just because I said all of that. This is your simple way of just seeing. So the amygdala is the fight or flight center of the brain, very relevant for our kiddos as many of them are in chronic stress as they're experiencing a lot of pain of trying to hit that dopamine, not able to, especially in the classroom. Another part of it is all those other things about the complex traumas, the stress of not, all the anxiety and the social loneliness and all of the things that are about being an adolescent in the first place. If they're in defense or their approach mode, we want to assess that as well. So the amygdala is an important thing to assess. The insula, being able to feel into the body. The cingulate cortex, how do we regulate what is felt in the body? And the prefrontal cortex, which is the decision-making part of the brain that says, hey, I want to be a steward of my own experience. So I need to be able to get that body online by being able to feel into it so that I can make the decision I want to be a steward of my own experience. So I want to take a pause and I just want to check in to see, are there any questions? Because I know our timing, but at the same time, I want to really recognize that was a lot. So does anybody want to ask any questions or do you want to hold them until the end?
You're all welcome to either unmute and ask a question or raise your hand, put it in the chat.
There's tons of chat questions right now. Can I hold those chat questions to the end? And is there anything specific for this particular topic?
Yeah, no, not at all. Actually, just
keep
it's all
going.
kind of more about logistics. So yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, good. So here we go with prevention and thinking about our kiddos, right? So some of us are not with kiddos that are at like a full stage of addiction. We're more at, I want to create some more balance and help my kiddos really understand the mechanism of dopamine. And I also want to help them just find balance in their lives. So these are examples of the ways that we can help our kiddos find balance in their life. We can educate them around this. We can implement some of this in the classroom, and we can also educate parents on how important these exercises and activities are. Physical exercise, very important. Sports for social interaction, as well as we talked about like that healthy release of dopamine and being able to overcome adversity, feel that ability for the body to be productive, experience the reward of something successful, be able to experience adversity and know that we can cope through that adversity. Balanced eating so that we're not overdoing the sugar and the fats and all the like high dopamine hitting foods. Sleep hygiene routine, as we note that sleep hygiene in particular helps us cope. Meditation doesn't have to be anything like, it can be a bottom-up exercise. It doesn't have to be a top-down exercise. So a bottom-up exercise might be like a nice walk in the woods, outdoor activities being one of them. Mindfulness exercises, paying attention to what we're experiencing through our senses, noticing what our bodies feel, and just noticing what those senses are, those experiences are allowing us to feel through our senses. Experience of music, shifting the ability to experience different emotions through music, and, important projects, and engaging the mind mentally, and challenging the mind in that way. And then if we've really got that nice balance, there's no reason why we can't invite devices. It's not about the device. It's more about developing the agency around the limits for a device. And from the early part of the presentation where I talked about that 1 hour not being too much and 3 hours being more associated with lower life satisfaction, it's a nice way to start thinking about, what conversations we might be having with our young people around limit setting. My son just organically, as we talked about it after he left the car door open all night, as he was on his phone, decided 90 minutes was a good one for him. So, I think that that's really important to have these conversations. And we're going to also talk a little bit about like the ways in which you have those conversations. In the classroom, there's also prevention that we can do. Oops, here we go. And long-term dopamine release is associated with social connection, social interaction, promotes the balance of a lot of different chemicals. And so some of these ways that we can kind of think about how do we use this recognition of the need for these kiddos to balance dopamine is to start the year with classroom culture, talk about that culture, create an environment in which some of those sensory opportunities are there for them to be able to sense or experience safety, and norms and rules and expectations that also increase safety. The 3 C's, some of you probably already know, which is consistency, connection, connectivity, and my mind is going, what is it? Compassion, of course. So holding intermittent meetings to give them a sense of agency, assign classroom jobs at all ages so that they're engaged physically in the experience of being there. As you saw me physically experiencing myself in this room as I'm just looking at a screen and a couple faces, helps me a little bit more. Using breakout groups, and I want to really highlight this, it's not for competition, it's for understanding and sharing feedback so that this safety is really felt in the classroom and that connection is made through that experience of safety. Encouraging team support for helping others speak up, role play or theatrize content, breakout groups for problem solving, and think tank. These are just some examples of ways that we can kind of work intentionally while working the content. We can work intentionally with a healthier environment so that they're not in dopamine withdrawal while they're sitting in your classroom. Prevention at home, discussions with parents. I think there was a question about, what do we do about an enabling parent? In the same ways that we would do a conversation with our young people, and we'll talk about that in terms of the intervention. We do want to talk to parents about involvement in social media use. And there's no reason why parents shouldn't be involved in social media use, because let's face it, even in like couplehood, when I'm, 40 years old and I have a partner, I still want some form of an accountability partner in my life. So it's not so much about parent over shoulder. It's more about accountability partner and helping me be a steward of my own experience. That's why I say random and transparent checks. So it's not about checking to catch someone in the act. It's more about being really open, that I want to see, how are you doing in this relationship with, hitting that button, and what are the choices that you're making? Are you thinking about the choices that you're making? And let's have a conversation about it. Also limiting participation in group chats to close friends, because we want to also note that with this kind of hitting the dopamine, as I said before, it's easy to kind of move into more deviant behavior or more risky behavior. It gives us a higher dopamine hit. So we want to really think about that and help them recognize that, their social relationships should be knowns. And there's ways that we can help them with parental apps, and safewise.com creates a nice list of parental apps with reviews. And like I said, with the screen time negotiation, it's not about, okay, I'm just limiting because I'm being punished. It's more about, oh my gosh, what are all the really long-term dopamine fun things that I can do throughout the day? And can I negotiate, and with Arista 90 minutes, can I negotiate a 90-minute of either playing games or watching a TV show, or, building something on Kirka, right? So it's about the negotiation of that particular like high dopamine, yield experience with long-term dopamine yield experiences. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about intervention at school in the classroom. First step is we want to establish safety. As I said before, if we're in the fight or flight center of the brain or in the limbic center of the brain, we're really not going to get very far with really helping, get cooperation. Step 2, engage reflection of the consequences. Step 3, assess receptivity versus defense mechanisms. I have slides for each one of these. Step 4, educate. Teach mindfulness, engage agency. 5, collaborate to set limits. 6, task for purpose. 7, listen, engage socially and emotionally. So step 1, establish safety, like I said. Why do we establish safety? Because we really want to move them out of fight or flight. As we said, fight or flight, the frontal lobe isn't working, decision-making is impaired, and they're more inclined to hit that sugar water. The other thing is we talked about like a little bit of some of the results of the last, 10, 15 years, is a lot of them are under chronic stress, as they're in a lot of like chronic feelings of discomfort. So some of them are in almost like a restless inertia space where, and it's this HPA dysfunction. Some people might understand what that is, but it's kind of this idea of being frozen and anxious at the same time. And so we really want to help them kind of get out of that by feeling a sense of agency in their conversations and relationships with us. So how do we do that? We create an emotionally validating environment to have conversations. We validate their emotions and their experience without co-signing their behaviors. We build relationship, develop understanding, put ourselves in their shoes. Ways that we can help them without being like weird and saying, okay, like we're going to just like massage our, our ears, because sometimes that kind of freaks them out. We might give them a fidget ball, or we might have some, meditation music in the background. We might have some handheld puzzles that are available so that they can kind of fidget. And with that, they're getting a little bit of pleasure as they're like, ooh, I just, successfully did that. Or, ooh, I really liked that feeling. And the insula is able to kind of tap into a felt sense feeling in that moment. Some of them are super cool with burping in your class or, in your office. So if you want to help them activate the vagus nerve, those are all the ways that we can do that. Humming, singing, massaging our ears, our earlobes, laughing. I have a kiddo, like I said, this one, he likes to like make jokes, and that's a way that we can kind of get him more engaged. Ultimately, the deep breathing, when we activate the vagus nerve, deactivates the amygdala, brings about a feeling of safety and relaxation in the body. Another one that a lot of them like, because it's kind of like, oh yeah, like physical, is tapping, punching the air, splashing our face with cold water. Once we get them and we can have a conversation with them about what's happening, I think some people know what this Columbo approach is. Columbo's a great show, and he's just like so unassuming and really effective about having people tell on themselves. So we want to help them like draw that connection between what might be happening with them inside and what behaviors and choices they're making. And we want to do that in a curious, non-judgmental way. We want to help them articulate that the choices that they've been making may have resulted in the consequences. So, with class, it's kind of hard to like throw up an example right now. I'm sure some of you can really come up with one, but an example for me would be, somebody who wants to bring their phone into class, or like helping them to see that their avoidance of being able to come into class or into school might be associated with their use of social media and their phone hooked to them all night long. So there's just different ways that we can do this in kind of an unassuming, curious, way so that we can help them kind of connect those dots. Guess what? If they are in their space of really protecting their addiction, they're really not going to be cool with that. So we're going to have different signs that we're assessing. We're assessing signs of receptivity. So some of them are like, oh yeah, oh, like my kiddo, like, oh yeah, why do I do that? Is what he says. Why do I do that? And help me or take this from me. Those are all signs that he wants help. He wants to engage in some problem solving. So you can see they're reflective, they're remorseful, their tone is participating. Signs of defense mechanisms, rigid, shutting down position, lack of eye contact or hostile eye contact. They might minimize the connection that you're, inferring. They might refuse that input, rationalize, be unwilling to engage. Become more attacking, or, physically even attacking sometimes. If that's the case, we return to step one. We re-engage safety. We don't focus on the question of the issue at this time. And if we're thinking about limit setting, and sometimes we have to make that decision, even though they're not ready for it, there's going to be, a number of steps that we really need to think about kind of in the background. So, for example, taking a device away from a kid that is going to be aggressive needs to have a lot more thought involved than what we're talking about in particular with this set of slides. So let me see if I can get through this. I only have a couple more minutes, and then we'll see if we can spend a little bit of time on that. When they are engaged and they are interested, I like to use the hand diagram to explain like the amygdala, the limbic system, which is the pleasure center of the brain. And like that when I'm in my active addiction mode or I'm using that phone, my brain isn't online. So it kind of flips and then I'm not that reasonable and I might be more emotional. So I try to give them that kind of metaphor with the with the hand. And I try to explain, the mechanism of dopamine and how it affects their behaviors as they experience more imbalance. And I also, besides like that, vagus nerve stuff, I really try to teach mindfulness so that the experience of whatever discomfort becomes masterful in the moment. And then we might discuss, if they're open to it, these suggestions. And if we're kind of moving into a place where it's really a problem, there's a recommendation to abstain from some behaviors for 30 days and or regulate through limit setting. With Ariston, I got to be honest with you, I just say until your frontal lobe comes back online. So it's gone until your frontal lobe comes back online. And that makes sense to him. He becomes more social. He becomes more active in, the chores and like checking in to see like what needs to be done. He's just more a social being. And so when we have that experience, he's no longer preoccupied by when am I going to get it again? It's more about, oh yeah, you're right. That's what I've got to do. I've got to become a social being again. So step 5, collaborate to set those limits. These are examples of limits: time blocking, setting alarms, like I said, accountability partners, removing ourselves from the supply, putting away phones and charging them in another room. And again, like technology break with no limits, so we're not preoccupied by when we're getting it back. Tasking another purpose, which is like, how else can we find long-term dopamine solutions? A lot of those examples are what we'd use for prevention with some adolescents that are later in life. We do know that long-term dopamine yields have a lot to do with challenges because that's the whole purpose. So we want to increase more challenges for them and healthy novelty. And then step 7, listen and engage, and come back to that non-judgmental, but like really open place to have conversations with them. And if they're really not engaged, we want to be thinking about referrals. And the reason we want to be thinking about referrals is because a lot of times these process addictions are places of protection, and they're ways that they've been coping throughout their life. And underneath can be a lot of pain and emotion dysregulation, chemical imbalances that might involve some psychiatric needs, and then underlying traumas that we don't want to pull their Band-Aids off very quickly because there might be other, vulnerabilities or wounds underneath. So we want to look at referring out. We want to think about the kind of therapies that are effective in referring out, CBT, DBT, experiential therapies, If you have any questions about those, I can see if I can answer them kind of not in the chat because I can see we're really running out of time. Like I said, with the levels of care and the accountability, sometimes we need more structure than just one-on-one. We need more than just a check-in. So having an IOP where you're coming 3 to 4 times a day to check in about how we're doing with managing these symptoms really can be effective. And got to be honest with you, a lot of people end up in inpatient and residential for process addictions for some of the various reasons that I said in terms of the vulnerabilities that might be lying underneath. And then just for a little bit more reference, Conversation Zone and anxiousgeneration.com are just places that you can kind of check to see, other options for additional resources. So I'm very sorry that the end kind of squeezed through, but I kind of blew through it. Hopefully we got enough from this experience that we can have a conversation.
Yes, take a sip. Heather, I have to contradict you. You are a great presenter. You really, that was amazing. And you got it in. But I would love to, if you're able to answer a couple of questions, are you able to stick around for just a few more minutes?
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. And can you stop sharing your screen just so we can see each other a little bit better? So you are welcome to unmute, but I'm going to read one of them. What do you recommend for highly avoidant teens when you encourage them to make peer relationships and/or attend class and they refuse? Additionally, some parents currently enable this behavior and ask for students to sit in the counseling center all day, thus not allowing them to build coping skills and get back to class. Just curious what interventions might work then.
Yeah, so is this one that I can just kind of answer and ask? Yeah, so with a situation like this, and there's probably other counselors in this room, so I think it might be helpful for them if they wanted to kind of jump in. It's the idea of that triune brain and thinking about which part of the brain we're working with. And, if they're in highly avoidant mode, they're probably in fight or flight. And so we want to do as much as we can to get them out of fight or flight. We're not thinking initially about the timeline. We're just looking at the signs of, okay, are they in a more relaxed body state when they're, for example, coloring in the counselor's room or, using fidgets or having conversations. And we're looking for those breaks from being in defense mode to a little bit more of a receptive mode. And when we see that receptive mode, we redirect because, what we said early in the presentation is that they are more task avoidant. They are more avoidant of adversity because they're not practiced at being successful with it. So I'm going to say the worst thing that we can do is enable them to stay in the counseling room too long. But I'm going to say that that's probably one of the worst things that we can do. It doesn't mean that they might not have to toggle back and forth for a little bit, but it's the reflection of the counselor to be able to show the agency that sense of empowerment that they're able to accomplish even the task of going to one class and being successful with it.
Here's another question that I think is probably really common and a great one. I'm concerned about the loneliness epidemic among teens. I see teens who don't seem to want to engage in social relationships. Yeah. And so I'm going to share a little bit of personal with you with Ariston. Ariston's my son. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, he was saying, I don't really need friends. And you can see in the social loneliness scale, that's exactly what it says. There's a percentage of them that say, I don't really need friends. And as time went on in the pandemic, he actually said, well, it's not that I don't need friends, it's I don't know how to make friends. And it was that willingness to have the conversation, to understand what the barrier is, to then figure out what the next step, what the next intervention would be. And so, there are social skills groups out there. There's Art of Friendship. There's a social skills group at Ambler Counseling Center for adolescents. And it's a great way, and again, I'm going to use Ariston because he went to Ambler Counseling Center. He used the words, it helps me stay motivated, Mom. And it's so interesting because that's exactly what we're looking for. We're looking for that little bit of an indication of there's a reward to keep him motivated, to keep trying. And I want to say also that we want to experience a little bit of pain to find motivation. And so we want to sometimes create some leverage or
like I said, motivation by leaning on the pain balance a little bit through a consequence. And so sometimes we motivate through consequence. We might say, I know you really want to do this. I also know that you really want to do this, and this one's easy. So we're going to hold off on the easy one, and I'm going to give you a chance to do this one. And it's about the language, it's about the messaging. Because if the messaging is coming from a place of I want to connect with him, and it's a place that I want to be compassionate, they can feel that. And when they feel that, there's some safety, and they might be willing to venture out to try something. They're going to be less angry with you. And again, that's a situation where they're not in that place of defense around the pleasures. They're in this, I really do want to make friends. Is that making sense? And there's this kind of identity or idea of competitive motivations. And sometimes that's how we get them to move away from their dopamine hits, is we help them start to find some other competitive motivations, things that might compete with their other desires.
All right. Thanks a bunch.
Bye. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.